Single coil guitars are great for their clarity and their chime, but sometimes they come at the cost of sounding just a little bit too plinky and a little bit too thin, especially on your bridge pickup. And lately I've been getting a lot of questions from you guys asking how I dial in my sound on this Tele. So I want to walk step by step through how you can get your single coil guitar to sound bigger and better. Also, quick disclaimer, I'm not going to go super deep into what frequency ranges you need to cut or boost. I just want to make this really simple and approachable so that anybody can quickly make some of these adjustments to start improving their sound. So starting with the guitar itself, I found that the string gauge can actually make a big difference in getting your guitar to just sound a little bit beefier with some heavier gauge strings. I used to use 9s when I first got this guy, and it sounded good, but especially for some of the bridge pickup stuff in worship, I just found it getting kind of out of tune quickly. I do tend to have a bit of a heavier right hand as well. So I moved up to the 11s, which doesn't really give me as much flexibility if I'm going to be doing bends and crazy things like that, which is fine because there really isn't too much of that in worship music. But what it did do for me is it really helped kind of thicken the sound a little bit, but also kept my strings in tune and strong and kind of fighting back when I was strumming pretty hard. Also, as far as the guitar is concerned, you can definitely just use your pickup selector to flip to the middle or the neck position. But again, I really want today to be focused around the bridge pickup because that seems to be the biggest issue for people with single coil guitars and kind of where that thinness comes into play. So next, I think it's important to focus on your amp settings. So basically what we're doing here is we're starting with our foundation, really our guitar and our amp, because everything else is really going to be building blocks on top of those two things. And if we're already starting off with a really thin and plinky sound, it's going to be really hard to fix that later down the road in our chain. So for today, I'm just using a Strymon Iridium and I'm using the chime setting. I'm just running one of the AC30 IRs from Tone Factor. And I'm actually gonna go ahead and just dial everything to noon. That way we just have a bit of a basic starting point that we can build on from here. So here's just what that sounds like with nothing else on. So for me, this is already really, really bright. And like I said a second ago, everything later on in our signal chain, our overdrive pedals, all of that is going to be building on top of this kind of core bass tone that we're setting up right now. So I really don't want my starting point to be this bright. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna dial back some of the highs just to make this a little bit darker. You can see that I bumped the mid knob up. That's a little bit unique for the AC30 circuit. Basically what that is it's a high-end roll-off. So turning that up is actually rolling off some of the highs. And I like to dial back some of the treble as well. So let's hear how things are sounding now. Okay, so that's feeling a lot better for me. It's definitely a little dark, but like I said, we're gonna add in some overdrives later on, which will kind of brighten things up a bit more. I am actually going to dial the bass back just a little bit. When I was hitting some of those chords, especially like that G chord with the low E string, it just was kind of rumbling a little too much. Now EQ wise, I'm feeling pretty good. To me though, it does still feel a little bit weak. It feels like it's kind of just missing some body and some sustain. And this is where I really like to throw in a compressor. For me, I like to run one all the time and it just kind of helps build my bass tone so that's just a little bit stronger. A compressor isn't necessarily going to make any big EQ changes like we did with the amp just now. But what it is gonna do is it's just gonna kind of round out our sound a little bit more. It's gonna give it some body. So what it's gonna do is basically just increase our lowest volume and decrease our highest volume. So it's basically just gonna round it out, give it some of that sustain, and just make it a little more consistent. So So you can hear how much body that really added, and especially when it comes to kind of like that plinkiness where there's this really loud attack and then it dies kind of quickly with single coils. Compressors can really help for that reason too, just with how it's evening everything out. So now that we have a great clean tone, there are a few traps that we want to avoid falling into. And one of which is actually not paying attention to our hand placement. Where are we picking the notes? Are we closer to the bridge over here? Are we picking a little closer to the neck? There can be a huge tonal difference depending on where you are picking the note. Notice how much thinner things got as I started getting closer and closer to the bridge. And you could hear pretty much immediately as soon as I started moving back towards the middle, towards the neck pickup, it really started to darken up pretty quickly. So for me, the sweet spot that I really like to try to stay in is kind of like right in the middle here, maybe even just a little bit closer to the neck. Again, there's a time and place, if you're kind of doing that super compressed chicken picking kind of thing, it sounds great to be closer to the bridge down here because you really get that twang. But again, in the worship context on our bridge pickup, moving a little bit closer to the neck here can really help a lot. So here's what it sounds like again, just kind of in that sweet spot area. Now, like I mentioned before, this is kind of our foundation that everything is going to build off of. So another trap that we don't want to run into is if we have some kind of crazy EQ on our overdrives or something that's just going to cause all of this work that we just put into kind of building our foundation to sound great and take that and just mess it up. So I'm going to run through my Benson preamp and we can just take a listen to what's going on with the EQ. Does it still sound full and thick? Is it starting to get a little bit more thin? I've also set the knobs to noon as well, so we just have a bit of a starting point and we can see how things sound from here. So it sounds good. It is just a little trebly, especially when I was playing some of the higher stuff. It sounds just maybe it's cutting just a little bit too much for me. So what I'm gonna do is actually dial back the treble just a little bit. And I also noticed too that it was just a little bit boomy. It might just be a personal preference thing for me, but for my heavier gain pedals, I like to actually take out some of the bass. And I've just noticed that the Benson can actually be a little bit bass heavy. So I'm gonna take just a little bit of that out. All right, let's see how that sounds. So I'm pretty happy with how things are sounding with our core tone, with our overdrive pedals, and I actually want to focus a little bit more on maybe some more lead kind of parts that are a little bit higher up the neck. This is where things can pretty quickly get into kind of that ice picky territory, but one of the ways that you can really mitigate that is actually with the type of pick that you use. I'm a really massive fan of the Herdem grip picks that the Edge famously uses. If you use kind of that grippy, scratchy side, it can get a really unique sound for the attack of your note. I found that it really helps to cut through the mix a little bit more and kind of punch through, but it can also make you sound more thin if you're not careful. So flipping over to the flat side also can really help a lot if you're just finding yourself maybe up higher on the neck and it's just sounding a little bit too ice picky or too thin for you. For me though, I'm not crazy about the thickness of the flat side of the Herdem pick, so I also really like to keep a 0.73 millimeter pick on hand. I just find that the attack is a little bit nicer. It's kind of a better in-between for me between the grip side and the flat side of the Herdem pick. And I'm actually using these old Gear Supply Co. picks, so shout out to anybody else who still has a whole bunch of these left over. So here's just a quick run through of what each of these sounds like. Now, what I think might be one of the most important aspects of just sounding fuller and not sounding too thin is actually paying attention to the part that you're playing and what strings that you're playing that part on. This is going to be where the timbre of the note comes into play. If you're playing something maybe on the high E string, it's going to sound a little bit different and a little bit thicker if you play that same note maybe further up on the B string, or maybe even further up on the G string. So being aware of where you're playing certain parts and the timbre of those notes can really go a long way. So here's an example of what that sounds like. Notice how it was all the same notes, but it definitely sounded more thin on the G, B, and E strings on that first go around. And when I just moved that same part further up the neck on the D, G, and B strings, it really thickened things up a lot, so it wasn't cutting too much and it wasn't kind of in that ice pick territory. One of my favorite things to do actually is look for opportunities to play parts further up the neck on some of the lower strings, but also combine that with using the grip side of the Herdem pick. So it helps it still punch and cut through the mix well, but it doesn't get overly thin sounding with the attack and kind of the scratchy side of the pick. But now that we have our guitar sounding great, we really want to get the rest of our rig sounding great too. So I actually have a short playlist where I put together a few videos walking through exactly how to dial in a great worship tone from start to finish. So go ahead and check that out right up here, and I will see you over there.